when the calculus was run and Hiroshima was blown, and it's just massive slaughter, instant slaughter, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with an American president and American generals estimating we will lose 50,000 Americans from Nebraska farms and Louisiana swamps and Idaho forests, island by island, in marine warfare to get all the way to Tokyo.
Our people, 50,000 is worth more than your people.
Absolutely.
50,000.
And a person has, a general and a president has to make that decision. God didn't give me that test. He gave them that test. Who actually gets to go through and grade the test?
Yeah, we're not. You're not the
Not
parser.
me.
I'm not the parser.
Met a ghost of a king on the road when I first fell. Fire burning to my knees I fell. Met a ghost of a king on the road.
162, episode 162 of Sassafras, coming at you from
Stories are soul food.
smoky, warm Moscow, Idaho.
The chimney of the best state.
The chimney, yes. The chimney of the West. Yeah, it's great so far. Burn season's been pretty minimal, but the smoke is out today. And what are we talking about today, Brian?
I mean, today we thought we'd wade into something long. History.
Poke a bear?
Yes. The whole world is talking about history. And
of course they are.
History literally has the word story in it. We thought, why not stories are soul food?
Okay, we're talking about history.
Specifically Churchill.
We're talking about people being upset about Churchill.
Yep.
Right.
And what appears to me being...
And Tucker interviewing that dude.
Martyr Made and all the other... That becoming the number one podcast in the world for a short amount of time.
I did not watch that interview in its entirety. I did see some clips that were, shall we say, kooky.
Kooky?
The Germans ran over their heads.
Yes, and that clip was distributed and taken out of context as well. I didn't even watch the interview. So
yeah, of course, everything is.
Everything just is
everything
dropped
is,
on its head.
And that's fine.
Right.
That's how it's done. So people who want to be anti-Churchill don't know history. We'll just say that. They don't know history.
Okay.
If we're talking with secular people, I can understand why they wouldn't like Churchill. If you're talking with believers, it's like, okay, so how are we on King David? How are we on Samson? Where are we landing with these different characters? How do you feel about Cyrus the Persian, who was a precursor to someone? It's how do we feel about these people? And I think that question right there, for me, is the root issue of all of the problems. And it's how do we feel about them? As opposed to what did they do, how they did it, and so on. And the reason why we struggle with how do we feel about it is because how we feel can be very complicated.
Yeah.
So
you think trying to reduce a historical figure down to am I feeling pretty good about him or feeling a little bit yucky?
Like
is such a postmodern way to view a character in a story.
If the leaders of the church, the leaders of the believing evangelical church in America, to get really specific, were more like Churchill, we would all be better off. And if they were more like Churchill, we also, in some other ways, we also would all be worse off. So when you're talking about characters,
how frustratingly fair of you,
Nate. What you need to understand, and I've said this before about conspiracy theories too. This is really, really important for every single individual out there. You are not the judge. Like, we do not get to adjudicate history like this. We do our best to read it, study it, learn the movements of it. But understand, if you try to get granular and you try to start sitting on a throne, alternatively a high horse, and judging people in the past, you're loaded with prejudice. You're loaded with a lack of objectivity for whatever reason you have going. And you just have to trust the fact that God has already judged this. You know, it's like this is, Churchill has stood before his maker and has been judged justly. Stalin is the same, and so on. All these people are have been judged justly. If somebody who's a tradesman in Des Moines can't, or having trouble. I'm having trouble navigating this. I'm having trouble figuring it out. It's like, well, good news. It's not your homework. It was never assigned.
Okay.
You don't have to pass that test.
Yeah. Your judgment of Churchill.
It just doesn't matter. And your opinion as an individual person sitting here in 2024, somewhere in North America, your opinion of Churchill could not matter less than any other thing. Like it's like, did you know in 1764, somebody put a horseshoe on wrong? His name was Devon and he did it badly. Like, okay. I mean, it's that level of just insignificant is what our individual opinions are of a man like Churchill.
Okay.
Now,
so you think that's the grounding point that we need to start with when we're starting to do a conversation about a big historical character?
Be willing to step back. Be willing to step back and watch the movements of nations and to watch these big clashes at a high level and understand that you will never be able to see into the hearts of these individual people advocating for particular things. Churchill was an imperialist. He was an absolute imperialist. Mm-hmm. The crown, the crown, the crown, the crown. Like he was absolutely there. Is he there in ways he ought to have been? I don't care. Like I just don't care about that. And I don't need to care because that's been washed away. The whole thing's been washed away. The empire is gone. That level of washed away. At the same time, I can learn a lot from his known history, as opposed to those things he said in private or whatever else. His known history in terms of politically toxic, people didn't like him, violent in his demeanor, uncouth, clever,
heavy drinker,
heavy smoker.
Yeah.
You know, all those things came from if you dive into his upbringing and his mom, like, wow, complete brokenness, catastrophically broken family, you know, and this very tough bulldog Brit comes up and he was useful to no one for nothing. Mm-hmm. Like, what do we have this tool for? We have this like surly dog around. Yeah. And then Hitler decides to conquer the world. It's like, okay, what did we have this surly dog for?
Yeah.
Did that surly dog behave in all perfect ways? Why would you expect it to? Like, why would you ever expect that? And I'm not disappointed that he didn't. It's just, it's an expectation that he would do courageous, bold, brave things and also misbehave like a surly dog. So
yeah,
I don't.
I guess part of what, as someone who loved World War II, I think that's fair to say. You know,
as a story,
grew up reading it. It does feel to me that that's one of the things that we've been told over and over again. This is the foundational maybe this represents it well. I remember my wife telling me she was showed a picture of a bunch of American GIs lined up outside a brothel in Paris. Yeah. You know, and that shocked her for a second because she was like, wait, this is the greatest generation. These are the best and brightest of our...
Brian, the local economy was struggling over there.
And so that's the question where I think maybe so many people have a positive view the other way. They're not viewing him like a surly dog. They're viewing him as the hero.
But basically that filtration,
yeah,
all of it boils down to what? How do you feel about him?
But I guess...
could you walk up to those GIs in the line at the brothel and hug those boys and thank them for their service and walk on?
Yeah, I mean, it's after...
I could.
It's after Normandy, yeah. So, I mean, they went through D-Day.
Yeah, this is one of those things where it does not in any way absolve any moral sin or moral failures in any way. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
But it just means you have to actually not have your feelings riding the tide of the situation.
Another example
as
for me
opposed
would
to
be
your objective awareness of it. Now, in terms of the Germans, like, I don't even want to talk about the kind of idiots who tried to soften how evil the Axis was. It was evil. Mm-hmm. It was bad. It was very bad. We know this because the Germans are highly organized and kept meticulous records of their misdeeds. This was not swept under the rug. It was unique. There have been horrors before, absolute horrors of war, of conquest, other brutally awful things. But this one, there's a whole bunch that was just, sitting there for us. And
So what's the place though, I guess, for Peter Hitchens, writing The Phony Victory with pretty much a critique of Churchill?
yeah,
What he's obviously he's a journalist and is fighting a current fight with a nation that thinks I think is still that empire. And
sure. I honestly, it's interesting to me because you need to care about the truth. But Churchill is not a person. He's not a person that the current empire, either empire, theirs or ours, would like or does like. Actually,
right.
It's just an idea, like a national championship banner in a gym. It's like you're looking like, man, back in the 40s, what a great team that was. And somebody's like, well, actually, the coach was an alcoholic. And it's like, it's just a banner in the gym at this point. Churchill is just an idea. That's it.
Yeah.
And he's an idea of greatness, and he's an idea of nobility, and he was those things.
And toughness, yeah.
Yeah, courage. And so if we look at RFK right now, how much do you agree with RFK on? Historically speaking.
I mean, not a ton.
Not
right?
a ton, right?
Yes.
Not a lot.
Having listened to his speech after you told me to.
Yeah. If we look at RFK
Yeah.
and we look at what he just did, was courageous.
Yeah, and
that was courageous. It was bold. What
Following-
Trump did on
yeah.
the stage after he got shot was courageous.
This felt like a second act of a male politician that you're like,
Right.
that is a politician that I would vote for.
And he actually, he wants it to be his final act. I mean, one of the things he's saying, honestly, is I don't have very many productive years left.
Right.
And I want to focus on actually using them to truly change corruption, fight corruption, and so on. And so he's willing to just burn down so many relationships to stand with Trump and to do what he did. Mm. You could have plenty of things to object about and still look at that and be like, that dude's courage. That's courage.
Yeah.
Like, that was courageous.
All his social policy.
Yeah.
We're like, no, thank you.
His VP is horrifically bad.
Right.
Steph Curry.
Yeah. Going on
Like-
and standing up for abortion as a man who was almost aborted as a child.
It's like, what? Poor Steph. It's like
The most famous Christian.
just about up there.
Yeah, up there.
And so, like, okay, did he just pooch that? Yeah, he just pooched that. Do I still like that guy? Yeah, I still like that guy. I'm hoping some people are talking to him.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping this is not a turning point down a dark path and is actually like an interesting correction for him. But ultimately, that's in God's hands, and it's
Yeah.
not in mine.
I know for him, you sit there thinking about motivations and hope that he realizes he's being steered.
Right, obviously.
Like this,
Because he
this
never
Steph-
even said the right to abortion. He never even said any of that. He said the code words to it.
Right.
And so I'm thinking,
you
how
feel like-
unintelligent are you? How much are you surrounded by people who are saying horrible things to you? And then you came out and you said these things because you've believed what? And so
And
I know.
those guys are great at standing up for themselves, except he got moved out of his context. And it feels to me like he's just like, he's got handles all over and people
I
pulling
felt really
him.
bad for him because he did it awkwardly. It wasn't like he like after a game, he's actually, there's no awkwardness in how he speaks and everything else. It was like, it was awkward. It was clunky. And it was tragic.
I mean, I also hoped his wife isn't the one that is making him say that, because that's the vibe that I had of a man who's like awkwardly saying something because he knows
Yep.
he's been told.
Yeah. He's going off the script. He got handed walking out the door. Yeah.
Right. And so I was hoping that there can be some correction there.
We'll see. But, in the end, again,
Your question is
that
like,
story,
I don't need to feel about Steph Curry a particular way. Like
that's
kind of what you're saying.
you saw what happened, right?
Yeah.
And the question is like, what is the biblical way to feel about him? Like, what is the biblical way to feel about him? And it's like, well, honestly, I don't even have enough information to know whether I should just be full of pity, whether I should feel sorry for him, what I should be praying for. I'm like, I can pray
We
pretty.
can say it was wrong.
I can pray pretty generally. It's like he was obviously wrong. He made a huge mistake. This was a bad move. But like, okay, how do I become personally invested? How do I invest my emotions into the situation?
Yeah.
The question should always be, how ought I to feel biblically? Mm-hmm. What is the biblical way to feel? And in most of these historical situations, we do not have enough information or enough data to actually even discuss it, to figure it out. So,
Okay.
and we also are so uneducated as a people collectively that our theory of nation states, our theory of just war, we just don't know. We have no like actual worldview structure for it. We're without everything.
I mean, I see people throwing around giant terms in this discussion. So like the firebombing of Dresden now becomes a piece that we're trying to allocate responsibility for.
Yeah, and guess what? Somebody's going to get judged for it, and they probably have.
Right.
Like somebody's going to stand before the throne of God.
Okay, but here's the thing, though. Here's the thing, though.
And it's not the pilots.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's just not the pilots.
Right.
So.
Okay, so.
Churchill was great.
But how come? But how come so many people on Twitter, especially of an older class, reacted like you touched an eyeball when you discussed Churchill?
Because you touched an eyeball.
Okay, but what's behind there? That made me immediately want to react and be like, what are you hiding?
Not hiding. What is Churchill a banner for?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the...
courage, nobility, greatness. We have it up on the wall.
Yeah.
And then somebody comes along and is like, your championship banner sucks. And all the old alumni of that institution go, hey! We won that national championship fair and square. And especially when the person who comes along and says that is clearly an ill-informed moron. And there's, it's all nonsense. And they don't know what they're talking about. And I can look at some parts of some things I don't know. I just don't know.
Right.
Like I couldn't check the footnotes on a bunch of it. But some part of it I do know. And I'm like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
You're way off. And this is one of the problems people have reading newspapers, where they can read one article and see they know something about it and they see how wrong it is. Anybody who's ever been in the press can know how wrong it is. Oh, it's like ChatGPT. I just had somebody tell me like ChatGPT knows everything. And I was like, oh yeah? Like this was an actor. I was like, ask ChatGPT, what are all your movies? And it will get it wrong.
Yeah, we've spent a whole episode discussing a novel.
Yeah. And I said, it's like somebody asked like what books I'd written, and it made books up. It invented things, but boy, it comes confident.
Right.
And in this situation, when you've read in a newspaper one article about a subject you know something about, and it's completely baseless, it's totally broken. The citations are wrong. It doesn't understand any of it. And then we turn the page and we read something about something we don't know about, and we're like, oh wow, valid point. This is very good. We immediately trust the source. If you hear somebody who is well, let's just say wildly off base in one area, and then they're trying to be an authority in another. If they're wildly off base through, in this case, bad scholarship, like not having paid close attention, why would you assume they're amazing scholars over here?
Okay, but...
like N.T. Wright was lecturing us all today about gun control. Sure. Whatever, dude.
Yeah.
Just...
If we wanted to live in England...
it's available.
We wouldn't have left.
Yeah. If we wanted that, we are actually free to go live there now and submit to all that. It's just.
But
it's ridiculous.
Here's the question that the real people with red eyes want us to ask: is it because we're reacting to the post-war liberal consensus, and that's the eyeball?
No, it's a championship banner, and I'll tell you a secret: it's the last one.
Well, don't you think
it's the biggest one?
Don't you think Civil War is the last one?
Ours?
Yeah. Because if we go back and start looking at what actually happened,
obviously World War II was more recent than the Civil War. So
the last one. I see.
No.
Oh, that's what you meant. I thought you meant the last one.
In the line of championship banners,
it's the most recent.
It's the last one. It's the most recent championship.
Gotcha.
And it hasn't been one in quite some time. We haven't had a moment of incredible courage and nobility and greatness. And the British people showed incredible courage, nobility, and greatness. Britain did. Now, Peter Hitchens, and I've talked to him about this, and he wrote a book about it, and he's bemoaned the abolition of Britain in a book of that title.
And the phony victory is the one that I've seen him. This one,
and he's bemoaned that. And one of the things that he said is that Britain was conquered; they were an occupied nation, but Churchill chose to be occupied by the Americans rather than to be defeated by the Nazis. And it was like Britain was done. The abolition of Britain. Britain was over after World War II, and it was a question of which conquest. And they chose the conquest of the Yankees. And fine.
Okay.
But guess what? You didn't lose to the Nazis.
Yeah.
So congrats. I'm sorry not as people love trains or tea time as they used to. But I'm also not sorry. I mean, when it comes to it, I am straight up sorry, not sorry for the abolition of Britain. And I could concede all of his points and say, and I'm still proud of all of our ancestors who went over there and saved your butts.
Right.
Like, that was great.
Well, we were discussing like why do people get so emotional about World War II, and I think that is the heroism we grab onto. Like my grandpa was a fighter pilot. I do go back and grab that,
and you should. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so the thing is, if you're talking about some bad movie where played by Jason Statham or somebody else,
hey,
where some actor is a hitman. You know, and he's the gnarliest of all the evil hitmen. He's just straight up murdered people for 30 years.
For money.
For money. And he's the best at murdering. And then you reach a place where he's going to do just one last job. And of course, he probably has to buy himself out and he's whatever. We create some backstory where it's kind of tragic that he has to be a hitman.
Right. He didn't do financial planning extremely well.
Yeah. Whatever. He's an anti-hero. We have this anti-hero and he's got one last job. And then the representative of the Russian gang that he's subordinate to hands him a picture of a child.
Right.
And he says, I don't do kids.
Right. Yeah.
And we have that kind of...
I mean, the script writes itself.
Yeah. It's like, okay. And then you have somebody who's like, I won't do that. And then they take a stand and they fight on the good side against horrible villainy. And they are successful. And they have this opportunity to achieve nobility courageously and sacrificially. And they do. Like, because this is that chance for redemption. This is that chance to have some value and see yourself as having some value because you've done something good and valuable.
Yes.
That's what powers that whole second and third act of that story. And then what ends up happening, incidentally, in that movie, there's only two options. He wins, he destroys, he destroys the whole infrastructure that he helped build. And then he dies sacrificially for this little girl he was supposed to shoot, and he lays down his life. And now he's fully redeemed because he's done this. Or we have some version where he survives. It's like maybe he and she, the little girl, end up living as father and daughter off on some island. Whatever.
Yeah, they
Either
escape.
way, doesn't matter how it manifests. He has to give his life completely for her.
Yeah.
And he has to be willing to fight to the very last ditch for her in order for that arc to work. So we jump back and you read the story, and I'm talking about top line story of World War I. If I really want to get into Hitchens and everybody else, when we're talking about what was World War II, it was just a break into the armistice and a continuation of World War I.
Yeah.
And there's obviously
all the seeds for World War II set up in World War I.
And what was World War I? It's like, well, that was the grandchildren of Victoria having a big family spat. Totally petulant, overly entitled,
it's
imperial clash.
It's dueling culture moved up to nation state level.
Exactly. It was so ridiculous. It was this chivalric, entitled nonsense around the power of aristocracy. And, it was just the death of monarchy.
Yeah, it was
It was like
monarchy picking up.
And so it literally
using
was a
everybody
bunch
else,
of grandchildren of Victoria who were on different thrones at that point and in different kingdoms. And they had a big old family fight. And
since they aren't on the front lines, everybody else died for them.
yeah. And it was just horrific. And it achieved on the 11th second of the 11th minute of the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice.
A timeout.
Like, that's what they achieved. That's what was achieved in that. Horrible destruction, the industrialization of warfare, absolute brutality. I mean, just so bad.
Well, I mean, honestly, the destruction of Britain's only hope
Yeah.
at that point.
The obliteration of this young generation, the rulers who would have taken over the empire. And you have this clash of empires, and it's like they were eager to play with new toys in this warfare, but they had these old sensibilities about the nobility of riding, into Waterloo. They had this, they had all the sensibilities of another time with new guns and nerve gas and just pure hell that they unleashed on the common men. And on the younger sons of a lot of noble families where the younger son would be sent off. And it became so hellish, and everybody finally got to a place where let's just stop. The Treaty of Versailles is signed. It's really oppressive and blames Germany for everything. Like Germany has to just kind of take
Which incidentally is how sibling fights go.
Yeah. Nobody signed a little thing that said, well, faults on all sides. But it was so purely hellish. And then they oppressed Germany on the backside of it. That oppression was real. None of that changes the fact that Hitler was a madman, like an absolute madman who took advantage of that oppression and of that resentment and of that just ill health.
I mean, it was also a clever politician manipulating the political system and all that to get that power.
He was a theatrical nut job who played a character.
Yeah.
And the character was compelling, and he, called all these people in a Pied Piper-like way into a little mythology that was scratching an itch they wanted to believe that they could be great again. And it was that desire to hang a banner, to be great.
Yeah. And incidentally,
and
I don't think it's necessarily a bad desire, right? We're trying to play some of those as well, but it doesn't.
Okay, if you empty out what great means, just a desire to be great.
Yeah.
We could say a desire to be dominant in a way that was very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
So then he starts doing all the things Churchill said he would do. He's doing the things that Chesterton said he would do. Chesterton predicted how the next war would start, and it would be when Germany started, monkeying with the borders of Poland, I think is what he said. And it was from a ways back. He's like, this is how this is going to go. And that's exactly how it went. And so Germany then starts this crazy thing. They are angry, downtrodden, and just on fire with rage and looking for scapegoats. So the same kind of sentiment you see, looking for people to blame for their circumstances. Yeah. The same stuff you see in the hot fever swamps of social media that are real quick to blame the intangible Jews for whatever. They did that too. Like, we have to blame this whole class of people. We got to scapegoat these people. And then we're just going on the road with this. And so they are susceptible to a pretty dangerous narrative, to all the propaganda that was pushed and everything else. And Britain, meanwhile, is broken, has lost the flower of a generation. They don't have the nerve to do it. And so they're just sitting still. Churchill's making noise, and they're still just sitting still. Like, it can't be this bad. It can't be. Like, oh, Czechoslovakia. Oh,
remilitarization.
Yeah, it's like, no. And then now they're bombing London. It's bombers over London. And incidentally, America still does not come into the war. Like, so Germany is carpet bombing London, and we are like, well, let's.
I mean, we were playing our own game too, right?
In what do you mean?
Like waiting for, I think we wanted payment. We were hoping to do, we were playing a very economic, from what I understand, FDR was being quite smart.
Well, in some ways, he waited he waited and got things together. But I would just say that regardless of what he did, if a leader was deciding to enter a war and he did not actually have those conversations, he would be a fool.
Okay. Yeah.
It'd be really foolish to just say, no matter the cost,
sure,
we're coming.
Sure. And then finding out how desperate are you actually? Like, I think is a lot of those questions.
What is the actual situation? Can we cross? Are we capable of crossing the Atlantic? Can we actually do this? All that stuff was really difficult. But one of the biggest things was there was enough sympathy for what Hitler was doing. The eugenics movement was pioneered over here. I actually take the name Laughlin for Ashtown Burial series and
one of your villains.
Yeah, and have Edwin Laughlin, who's Dr. Phoenix in the Ashtown series, descended from this guy who was a school teacher, I think in Pennsylvania, who actually helped draft a whole bunch of eugenics legislation that actually was brought into law in America first, we were getting there first. We were doing
Margaret
this.
Sanger and that,
We
that
exactly.
whole situation.
Planned Parenthood is happening.
The
We're
book
trying
from,
to eliminate human weeds.
From Darwin to Hitler. That
Yep.
book is a fantastic. Hey, going back to what you're saying, you're not saying, hey, yeah, we feel about the Germans as if they're the most evil, but it's like, hey, we get all this big.
We got there first.
We got there first.
They
went farther,
and then they took it. Hitler actually took things directly from stuff we were doing in the States. We were forcibly sterilizing people. Like we had.
Oh wow.
We had local sheriffs. We had government all the way down to the local level, rounding people up and doing forcible sterilizations. We had all that going on. Like that was going on over here, which is insane.
Yeah.
And then Hitler took it another step farther and started invading other countries. So FDR didn't just have a big base of support for being anti-Hitler in America. It actually took a long time because still there were people who didn't see it. They took what we were doing. We started down this road to hell with eugenics, abortion, everything else. They hopped on next to us and went faster. And then it put us in this situation where we are going to go fight them. And it set eugenics and it set all these movements way back. Because
thank God for that.
Yeah, right?
You're like, whoa, look where they just ended up.
It would have been very easy for us to be the big villains of the 20th century. And instead, they went there first, and we ended up with a moment that was the greatest generation. And it was these guys who went over and won 2 wars, 2 theaters. They won in the Pacific and one in Europe at incredible sacrifice, many of whom had never been out of the country. Yeah. Like farm boys, city boys.
So it's okay in some sense. That's how humans work. That tipping point right there, it makes sense that we're reading what came after. Yeah. In light of that tipping point at World War II, watching what happened.
And I think that England was abolished fundamentally. And so I understand why people look back at that banner. And that banner, that meant something. Because do they have another one coming? I mean, it's like it was a moment of greatness, sacrifice, and it cost them literally everything.
Yeah.
And prior to that, they had the empire, but they actually became ashamed of that. That whole, like all the anti-empire sentiment that showed up after the fact and was even downstream of World War I. Like people started to be way, way more anti-empire in a way that they hadn't been all the way back to the early Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And even before. So it really did kind of end the imperial age and send us into World War II. Churchill is this surly dog. And he had blood on his hands from earlier in his career and the Boer War and other stuff.
Well, here's the question for you. Where do you think the place for, New York Times bestseller, Unnecessary War, Pat Buchanan, like that situation, which is kind of, this isn't a new conversation people are having about Churchill.
Yeah, but I think that was dumb too. And the question is, unnecessary war. Every single war is unnecessary. Like it just is.
I do think I also see people.
If everybody was behaving righteously, if everybody was behaving correctly, there is no need for one.
Yeah.
Like just given that.
I think also people who push on, hey, Hitler wanted peace after he took France and Poland. It's like, well, yeah, no duh. It's like the playground bully got it. He got his way and was like, yeah, I don't need to go across the water to this island. Like
anybody who thinks he was not going to is out of their mind.
Yeah, you think so?
I don't think so. That's just.
I mean, it fits. I mean, clearly he wanted to turn his attention next to Russia. I mean, it's like that situation.
Well, remember when I said he was out of his mind? Yeah, he was out of his mind.
But I think that's where the idea of the unnecessary war comes in. Is that I have a hard time buying that argument as well. That Churchill agitated for and caused and brought about this war that could have ended in a different way. No. I think, like you said, it started with World War I, and we're in the middle of a. But at the same time, this is one of the things where I was saying, are you sure you want to talk Churchill? Because I didn't read the books since I was in sixth grade.
Think this is one of the things that matters the most, is we didn't do a bunch of research for this. I think it actually matters to be like, okay, we're 2 guys in Idaho.
Yeah.
And we know some of what we know. And what are the odds of some of it being incorrect? 100%. Right. How much does that stress me out? 0%. Like like this is, like I said, this is something I find really interesting, and we try to study history, see the movements of narrative at a high level, try to find those noble characters. Without Churchill, England loses. Absolutely. Like, not even a question. Right. He was amazing in his stubbornness, his courage, and what he did.
And the sheer motivation of leading that kind of people in that situation.
Yep. And leading a people who achieved something truly and profoundly great and amazing on the heels of having lost an amazing generation in World War I. And they had to dig in and stand, like the Knights of Malta in 1565. They had to dig in and stand against this. And the nature of it is like, okay, so Hitler starts doing what Hitler's going to doing. He's going to do. Ireland embarrassed themselves. Like, that's embarrassing. I am embarrassed that it took as long to get the U.S. on board, because I'm ashamed of what we were doing with eugenics and Planned Parenthood and trying to eliminate human weeds prior to that. We were guilty. We were already guilty as a people, as a nation. We were guilty of the same sins that Hitler then was guilty of, in a really, really high way. It's like we participated in something really, really awful a little bit, but then, like the hitman, he went further than we were willing to. And we were the guy sitting there being like, but we don't do kids. Right. We're not going to do this.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
We downplayed the treatment of the Jews throughout the run up to the war and into the early war. It wasn't until we were liberating concentration camps and normal American men, not the politicians who'd been complicit in the eugenic stuff, none of that. Normal American farmers and mechanics and, fishermen, guys just from the earth, were walking through these gates into these pockets of hell and seeing what they'd actually done. It was, and the log books and all the records. It wasn't until normal America, Christian America, walked in, like not apostate America, walked in those places, that everything began fully coming out about the level of evil, the degree of the evil over there. The fact that the Third Reich was a demonic attempt, was a demonic movement, I think is indisputable.
Indiana Jones almost reality.
Yeah. And it was heavily occult, everything else that was going on. Yeah. And so when you touch Churchill, the reason why it's an eyeball was because it was this moment of massive peril, and Britain sacrificed everything. Following this man and his stubbornness and his nobility, sacrificed everything that they were, everything that they had been up to that moment, got sacrificed to stop the Nazis. Mm-hmm. All of it got put on the line, and most of it they didn't get back. They avoided the rule of Nazis. They slipped under the thumb of Americans. Yeah. They went into just huge economic ruin. Thatcher has to show up. It's right. And of course we have the Cold War going because
and then we gave a lot to Russia at that point too. So that all
we were so desperate to beat the Nazis that we were willing to hold hands with Joseph Stalin and the Soviets. And then World War II didn't end. It just stopped being hot. And we moved immediately into the struggle against the Soviets, having let them get a big foothold in Europe because we preferred that to the Nazis. And I think rightly, now we have to fight you. And again, back to the movie, back to the story, where you have your rival he has to be on your side because now there's a greater evil.
The hitman's rival.
Yeah. The two hitmen who've always hated each other. Suddenly there's a vampire that comes up and is going to destroy everything. And they have to join forces and do this. And then after they kill it, they're going to turn back on each other, and there's going to be this struggle.
So you're saying there's no need for us to go see through everybody?
No.
Like that idea of like, hey, we need to go see through all FDR's motivations.
There's no need, and there's also no possible ability.
And if that's your thing, what if you like World War II?
If you love, that's great. Yeah. Research it, study it. It's part of God's story. It's part of what he did. You can find all sorts of amazing examples of heroism, of darkness, of God's justice. Yeah. You can find all these things throughout it. I enjoyed the goofy little Guy Ritchie movie I just watched with my kids, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is very loosely based on a true story, but some of Churchill's papers were declassified, I think, in 2016, and this was sort of the invention, people believe, of SEAL teams and the kind of like dark ops, and that Churchill did to try to sabotage German U-boats, abilities so Americans could cross the Atlantic because we were failing, all that stuff. So it's a Guy Ritchie film, and it's funny, filtered. But again, like I watch it and I'm like, do I really need to figure out how much of this was adaptation, how much of this was truth? Do I need to go back and really study why Churchill did this, or how he was defying the Admiralty and how he was actually breaking the law in doing it? No, I don't care. Like, I just really, really don't care. I don't have the ability. So ultimately, and this is what matters. So getting this back to feelings, what just happened with COVID?
We all just learned to distrust experts,
right?
Because they're
yeah
totally biased.
Now, do I need to know exactly what was in Fauci's heart?
I hope not.
No, because I can't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't need to know exactly what was in his heart to know that what he did was tyrannical and corrupt and evil. And it can be tyrannical and corrupt and evil in its visible outward actions, in its outward motions, without me needing to be able to see into his motivations and his heart. Now, if he happened to write a bunch of stuff down and his journal ends up published, it's like, well, maybe I'll see a little bit more. But even so, I just don't need that. I am not the judge of the universe. I am not the judge of history. It's my job to go study it, read it, where God has given me access, and be edified by it,
So
to try to grow out of it.
Perhaps what you're saying is you're actually not the parser of history.
No.
You're not the person who has to do.
I'm not the parser of motivations. I'm not the parser.
But we still, because a lot of what we do on a podcast is actually that judgment. And you're saying, hey, Judge Fauci bad, Churchill good, and I don't have to go in and find out if he messed things up in Crimea. I don't have to.
But
go
it's not a
find
blank
out
check. It's not a blank check of
to say
of
he's
good.
Great. Yeah,
to say that he showed great courage, nobility, and leadership and resolve in winning and in bringing the British people with him. Oh, of course he did. Did he do any dirty deeds? It's like, well,
does he bear part of the responsibility for Dresden? You know, like those kind of questions.
I don't know, but the one who does is going to judge justly. So I'm not like, it doesn't cause me any heartburn at all. Like it doesn't.
Okay.
And God will judge justly. So let's imagine something here. We're making something up. So I happen to be strongly of the position that because of the oaths of office, because of covenant, because I think a president he needs to, and generals need to care more about the lives of their own men and of their soldiers and of their nation state than of the lives of citizens and civilians on the other side. So when the calculus was run and Hiroshima was blown, like boom, there goes, and it's just massive slaughter, instant slaughter. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with an American president and American generals running calculus and saying we're estimating we will lose 5,000 Americans. We will lose 50,000 Americans from Nebraska farms and Louisiana swamps and Idaho forests if we have to actually push island by island in marine warfare to get all the way to Tokyo and to actually take this whole,
And so you're saying, well, this is where I think you make lots of enemies, but that sort of calculus of, our people, 50,000 is worth more than your people.
Absolutely.
50,000.
And a general and a president has to make that decision and to put value on the citizens of an enemy nation who are now fighting down to the last man. Some of the stories my grandfather told me about the resolve of these Japanese fighters is beyond comprehension. The stoicism, the culture, the mythology they had in their DNA back centuries of the belief really was that they were going to fight to the last male, basically, and then also many females. Like that was the belief. This is going to be enormous slaughter. Every single city. Yeah. We're going to have to go through. This is the nation of kamikaze pilots. This is the nation
seppuku.
Yeah.
This
is the name my grandfather described for me Japanese guys bayoneting themselves to trees when they're going to die and continuing to fight from that position when they can no longer stand upright. And then remaining bayoneted to that tree enabled them to waste a few bullets for every Marine who came around the corner. Like, it was like they're willing to die excruciatingly at their own hand, slow down what they were able to do, and just in order to draw a little bit more fire as a a target dummy. So, like, that's what we're looking at now. Whether the generals were right or wrong, like, okay, they have to make that calculus. That is the homework they were given. That's the assignment they were given. Mm-hmm. It's not the assignment I was given. They should have stayed up all night praying. I don't have to.
Yeah.
God didn't give me that test. He gave them that test. They were sitting there in that moment, and they had developed this tech. This tech was here now. They had it. They had a bomb. And they believed they could break the will of the emperor and the whole nation very, very rapidly, and with entirely Japanese casualties, saving the lives of the Americans under their command and sending them home to their families. So they believed that. Now, who actually gets to go through and, grade the test?
Yeah, we're not. You're not the
not
parser.
Me.
I'm not the parser.
Like,
yeah,
I'm not that guy, and so I can look at it and I can say, yeah, that was the assignment they were given. The work that they say that their estimates of how many American lives were saved by doing it this way, they made the decision they made. Now, when it comes to Nagasaki, dropping that second one, was there a surrender in motion? Like, was there already, a surrender coming? Did they have it in hand but not admit it because they wanted to drop the second bomb? You know what? I can't possibly know.
yeah.
I don't know that.
Are we trying? Were we trying to show the Russians? Just a thing or two.
It's like there could be. It's possible there could be a completely immoral shenanigan that goes on there in order to drop the second bomb, or not. I can't know that. Mm-hmm. And it's not my job to know that. I haven't been given that homework. God didn't give me that homework. But I can tell you, if that's what they did, they'll be judged for it. They have been judged for it. And if that's not what they did, if they actually sat there thinking like, oh man, we were totally right because we just dropped that bomb and they still haven't surrendered. Like, we got nothing. And then we pamphlet the next city and we drop all our pamphlets telling them to get out, just like we did before. And they all know they're next and they don't leave. A bunch of them don't. And Japan does not surrender. And then boom, we drop the second one and now they surrender. So did they pass that test? Did they do a good job of that homework? The stakes were incredibly high. The test they were given was incredibly high stakes in human lives on both sides. And this is what they did. Now, in terms of them saying this was our calculus and that we believe it was correct, and this is how it played out, they surrendered. And we didn't have to send all the U.S. Marines, through the entire chain of islands. It appears like they did their math right. It appears to me like, seems that way. But do I have access to all the back rooms and all the conspiracies and what we wanted to spook the Soviets with? I have no access to any of that. And I don't have a right to have access to any of that. God will judge. And I have to just rest in that and be comfortable there. I have no problem with that.
Yeah, what's interesting, jumping back to, Darryl Cooper and the Martyr Made, he's doing the same calculus on the Old Testament as well.
Yeah.
So he wants to run the parsing on, is killing all the Amalekites justified or not? And he's very clearly on like, no, this is obviously a very bloodthirsty thing to do. So the Yahweh of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Extremely.
And then so the
like the parsing there.
The TV show I was working on that's now in production. When we were working in the early versions of it, one of the things that was a very, very high priority for me was having the story play out in a way that every single housewife in the suburbs of Nashville would be relieved and thrilled when Samuel Huday gagged to pieces. That every single American would understand the command to eliminate the Amalekites. And if we are not telling the story honestly or accurately, if there's any sympathy,
if it's just like a random guy who got nuked,
for those poor Amalekites, because if you tell the story wrong, then God is the villain. And so that's not, if you tell the story wrong of World War II and you're looking at Churchill and you're like, I think he's a little more villainous than people have thought. Like, you know what? I don't care. He was still the good guy. Probably. He drank too much. He smoked too much. He came from a horrible broken past and went through a horrible boarding school system. I'm sure he did and had done horrible things to him his whole life. And I'm sure he actually walked around with all those scars and all that darkness. Now, did he do something noble and courageous with the British people here? Yes. Well done, you. And I would put a bust of him in my office to remind me to be that stubborn in that kind of fight and have no problem with it whatsoever. No, and I really respect his intellect and his ability to write and deliver speeches and inspire as well. So you have all of that, right? But the stakes there are pretty low, ultimately, because if I'm wrong, oh, there's a dude who's worse than I thought. Oh, well. Now, in the Amalekite situation, Agag and the Amalekites are awful, awful, awful and need to be absolutely eliminated, including the animals. Absolutely eliminated. And if you're wrong, if they didn't deserve that, then it's God who's the villain. It's not Churchill, where you're like, oh, Churchill's a little more villainous than I thought. If you go to the Amalekites, it's Yahweh. And it's like Agag is worse than people thought, or Yahweh is worse than people thought. And where are you going to go? And so that show, it was very important to me to communicate the nature of the Amalekites and to do it honestly without also wallowing in grotesqueries such that people couldn't watch it.
Right.
Yeah, so we had to walk this fine line. As far as the final version that's actually been shot, it's already been filmed. I'm not sure. I have no idea where they landed. I would guess that they didn't do it exactly how I wrote the first version, but we'll see when it comes out. You know, when it actually releases, we'll
remind everyone the show you're talking about.
I haven't said.
Oh, I see.
It's House of David is what it's called. It's been in production, just in the Wall Street Journal. But the original version of that script, I wrote the first 2 episodes. And in those episodes, that was a big thing for me. A big thing for me was Agag. We need everybody just begging Samuel, like he's gotta like take him out. Saul should have taken him out. We need everybody thinking that Saul has failed here. We need people understanding that Saul's failure is not a failure to follow an arbitrary command that seems really awful. It's the failure to follow a command that's clearly not arbitrary and has absolute moral justification. And he's failing to follow that command. And that's, so in navigating that one and going way back even further in history and judging something like the Amalekites, it's different than Churchill. Because if I'm wrong on Churchill, there's almost no stakes. He's a human. Of course he was broken. Of course he was flawed. Did he make more mistakes than I know about? Probably. And it doesn't really cause any heartburn. But getting into the Old Testament, we're looking at David, when we're looking at Samuel, when we're looking at Samson, we cannot judge where God does not. Yeah. And if we get those narratives out of whack, then we are adding guilt to Yahweh, not some random Brit who happened to be standing in a really brutal moment.
Well, I think
in history.
the only place it would work is if you say, hey, Churchill and U.S. were the bad guys in World War II. And that's obviously stupid.
Yes. Yes.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
You could say that Churchill and the U.S. were worse than we realized. Like, okay, and yet we still should have won. And I could do this easily. I can actually. Here's an example of this. I'm really glad the North won the Civil War.
Yeah.
Like, hooray! Yeah. I'm grateful we had a union. I'm grateful slavery was abolished. I'm grateful for all those things. And yet Lincoln preemptively arresting the entirety of the Maryland state government before they had done anything, just to protect himself, violating the Constitution.
Yeah.
And the president arresting an entire state government so that he wouldn't have an enemy on his doorstep if they turned out to be an enemy, which had yet to be determined. That was evil.
Yeah.
And yet I'm glad he did it.
And there's lots of other.
So I can look at that and be like, man, I'm grateful that God had the story go the way it did. I'm grateful God
even though we're paying for it now.
Yeah, we are paying for it.
Yeah.
But that's an example of, I think both sides were worse than people realize, and both sides were better than people realize. So that's one.
Yeah, our Civil War episode is next week.
you could get to World War II and say, man, the Allies were worse than we realized. Okay, so it turns out they were a 3, not a 2. Hitler was still an 11. Like he was still an 11. We know that Stalin was at a 9. He was in an 8 or a 9, and we were willing to join forces with him in order to take out Hitler in that immediate moment. And then we had to turn all of our attention to him. My grandfather was actually, he told me that his promotions, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, was in Berlin. He was still in Berlin. He stayed in after the war. He actually stayed in through Korea and then was still in for Vietnam and got out right before Vietnam because he was just, I can't be involved in 3 wars. But
not how America felt about it.
Yeah, you're right. So he was in Berlin when the Soviets started throwing up the Berlin Wall, and it was barbed wire, and it started springing up, and he raged in an office, insisting that the U.S. bulldoze it immediately. And he's like, do it right now. First crime scene, always fight them at the first crime scene. If you don't tear out the barbed wire, pretty soon it's going to be concrete. They're going to set it in concrete. It's going to become sacred. Bulldoze it now. And he said that was kind of the end of his career, was throwing down over that. Like, he was still around for a number of years, but that's where all his promotions stopped. Like, he was a lieutenant colonel. He stayed a lieutenant colonel, and nothing else budged for him, because he said he really was a flamethrower in that office. And then he applied it to our lives and was like, never, ever, ever wait to the second crime scene. Always fight to the death at the first crime scene. And what he told my sister specifically, but all of us, was if somebody's trying to throw you in a van, they grab you on the sidewalk, fight to the death right there, because your odds aren't going to improve in whatever basement they're taking you to. Wherever you're going to a place where they feel greater advantage, and that's why they're taking you there. So don't ever roll over at the first crime scene. Yeah. Push your chips in, all in. It was funny to have this old vet telling these little kids, we're all sitting there, and he's like, if anyone
bleed on the sidewalk,
you fight to the death, you drop, you kick, you scream, you do everything in your power, you make them kill you right there, rather than go off. And I was like, and my mom knew he was giving us his lecture. She was fully supportive, but it really stuck. It stuck with me. And a lot of it came from his experience with the Berlin Wall, actually, which he then elaborated on to us as little kids. So anyway, all this to say, we don't have to parse or adjudicate or arbitrate all the complexities that are not ours to adjudicate. It's easy for me to have respect for Churchill as a man who has proven to have a great deal more courage than I have. Like, he stood when so many others were crumpling, and because he stood, the Brits stood with him. And I can respect the entire British nation for what they did in that moment, and not disagree with Hitchens that they were ended. Then in many ways, they were the hitman that gave his life completely. Like, it was over after that. They didn't just get the empire back.
Yeah.
It really was the end of the line. And of course, then their last great deed was helping form the nation state of Israel, but I'll just leave it there. Hooray.
It has been Stories Are Soul Food.
3 cheers for Israel.
Imagine the well-read man. Do you see a machine dressed in tweed, gorging on information? This book is not about becoming that kind of reader. The well-read man wakes up and consults with Moses on his way to work.
And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which hath brought thee out of the land.
He sips his coffee and ponders the wisdom of Hannibal's elephants crossing the Alps. He turns furrow-browed philosophers upside down and takes their lunch money. He changes his oil and deliberates with Peter Drucker about effective management practices. He regales his wife with the tale of Monet's water lilies in the gardens at Giverny. He sings with Sandra Boynton as his toddler's eyes grow heavy. This book is about becoming that man. Be as human as you can be. Learn how to read a book.